Welcome back to Tocqueville Talks. My name is Brent Nelson, and I am the director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society at Furman University. Today I'm hosting alone as my co-host Beth Larive is away, having done her own solo stint last week. This week we bring you a special treat, an interview with a superstar reporter, Eleanor Beardsley, who is a Paris-based foreign correspondent for National Public Radio. She also happens to be a Furman alumna and a dear friend. We talked about the current mood in Europe as the continent tries to manage pressures from Russia in the east and the U.S. in the west. We also talked about the strength of right-wing parties, European Union enlargement, and the place of European values in a power-driven world. But let's get right to it. Here's my interview with Eleanor Beardsley. Well, hi, Eleanor. It is really a privilege for us to have you on Tocqueville Talks. How are you doing this afternoon, your time?
Thank you, Brent. I'm doing fine, and it's really an honor to be on Tocqueville Talks.
Well, I wanted to start with something that The Economist said this week. They said that Alexis de Tocqueville was the first foreign reporter. And I thought, that is kind of cool. Tocqueville was the first foreign reporter from the United States to France, and you're one of the foremost reporters reporting from France to the United States. So we're just going to say you're like the modern day version of Tocqueville.
Well, that's a mighty big compliment, but thank you.
Why don't we just start with how you got from Furman University? We won't say when you graduated, but somewhere in the past. And
Yes.
how did you get to Paris? How did you get your job at NPR? Just give us that little story.
Yeah, I mean, I never had the idea of being the NPR foreign correspondent. And I often say that if I had, I would have never become the NPR foreign correspondent because, I mean, that would have been kind of like a dream. But I always followed what I loved. And what I loved was history, especially European history. And I loved French. I loved a foreign language. And I was okay after, it takes a while to learn a foreign language and you can study it in school, but it doesn't mean you're going to be able to converse fluently. So I took it at Furman. It was my minor. European history was my major. But I never stopped, I would say, learning French. And I was always determined to be fluent one day. And so honestly, it was my desire to follow that path, always looking to better my French. So I would go on vacations. I would take night classes. I moved to Washington, D.C. after Furman. And also just my feeling that there was something important out there. There was something worthwhile to do for me, just knowing all the history I knew and how the world had come to be. And I thought, one day I want to just travel in Europe. I want to be a businesswoman in Europe. So I followed different paths. And I think just the layers, one thing led to another. So at one point, I ended up working in the US Congress, which was a fascinating job, nothing to do with French really or European history, but that just opened up a whole world. But that job actually led to me getting a job as a producer at a French news network in Washington. And that was actually my first dip into reporting. I didn't do a journalism school, but actually having history and a foreign language is great training to be a journalist. And that just sort of got me on the path and just different things. One thing led to another. I tried radio. I visited a friend in Kosovo. It was right after the bombing in 2000. No, that was 1999, but I went in 2000 and I had these stories on the air for radio. And I was like, God, this is what I want to do. And it didn't become a reporter immediately. I ended up working for the United Nations in Kosovo, but always the history, just the fascinating, being in the Balkans, being in the former Yugoslavia. I just became obsessed with how that, Yugoslavia fell apart. And I've always loved just European history. So it all led and I to me eventually moving to Paris after I did my stint in Kosovo and starting as a freelance here. And I found out, at the time everyone said, "Oh, we have a correspondent in Paris and we have a backup and then a backup to the backup." So I thought, okay, this probably isn't going to work out. But actually it did because what I found out is that was kind of a time when the big, when you would get moved abroad with your whole family and get a house somewhere, journalism was changing and a lot of people were doing things, freelance or, doing the filming and the reporting yourself. So I moved to France. I didn't know, and I wanted to become a journalist. And that's when I found out that actually everyone is fascinated by France. And I got a hook on a really very interesting story that because I spoke French, because I was in France, I found out that John Kerry, who ran against George W. Bush the second time Bush ran, he didn't win, but he was actually he had a French cousin. He was French, and at the time it was seen
Mhm.
as very bad to have a passport and to speak another language. Anyway, so I found out he was John Kerry's distant cousin, and he was a mayor on this little Brittany town and ecologist mayor. And I said, "Can I come visit you?" And I went up there, and I had this, and I was the first journalist to have that. I think CNN got it, and then the Kerry campaign shut the guy down. They didn't want him to talk anymore. But I had that on the air, and it was just like amazing. And then the riots. There was some riots in the suburbs that broke out here in 2005, and I mean, I was getting contacted by I was doing radio and I was doing, USA Today. I mean, everyone was contacting me for something. And I realized, my God, everyone loves Paris. They want more stories on the French, on Europe, on everything. So I started as freelance and it just grew from there. My French actually came in again when the Tunisian revolution broke out in 2011. I was listening on the radio here going, wow, what's happening? And I said to my editor at the time, do we have anybody in Tunisia? He said, no, why don't you go? I'd never really been to an Arab country. And I went and I was just amazed at how just speaking French opened the door. I was lying in my bed. I remember call to prayers on at 5 a.m. And I'm thinking, wow, this is really a foreign, exotic place. But there I was reporting on it and able to talk to everybody because I spoke French and they speak French in Tunisia. So it just grew and grew. And from, since then, I've covered like the conflict in Ukraine. I go now to Israel, traveled around Europe. I cover France. And it's just been absolutely, really everything I could have would have never dreamed of doing actually. And every day I'm learning new things or using my history, of course, using my French. So it kind of like that one thing built on another, and I just followed what I loved
Yeah. Well, um,
and got lucky and got lucky.
we hope that that's the story of every Furman grad.
Yeah, yeah.
But it is, it's always a bit of luck, a bit of circumstances, and then a lot of
Yes,
hard work and taking advantage of those opportunities. And
absolutely, absolutely.
yeah, so good. Well, let's focus a little bit on your experience in Europe over the years. Um, what would you say would be the most important changes that you have seen, uh, especially politically? But Tocqueville was all about the social aspects as well. What has been changing in Europe over the last couple of decades?
I mean, I would say it was a big deal when the huge waves of immigration from the Syrian war happened in 2015. And there were just, hundreds of thousands of people coming from Syria and all these places into Europe. And Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, then welcomed them. And it was just, some countries were just absolutely freaking out. What's another word for it? Like hungry, just absolutely did not want any immigrants. Some countries welcomed them. It just produced all these problems in the EU. So that was a huge change. Obviously, the in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia did take Crimea in 2014, which is when I started going to Ukraine, and we could see the cracks then. But the full-scale invasion in 2022 just really just blew things up. It was just people couldn't believe it because, I came actually to Paris in 2004 and the one theme that was always there was 80 years of peace. We've built this, the Franco-German alliance. There's no more hatred. We will never have a war like that in Europe. And it was hard to imagine even having a war like that. I remember being at D-Day anniversary, the first year the Germans had been invited back. Actually, I think that was actually in 2004. And that was a big deal. And so to see another war, land war, break out on the continent, and by the way, this war in Ukraine has just gone longer than World War I officially.
Yeah.
That was huge, huge. And then just when you think things couldn't get any bigger came the second Trump administration, where we kind of watched, it seemed like the US was abandoning all of our, not abandoning fully, but our allies, our principles. All of a sudden, President Trump is sort of siding with Vladimir Putin, and not he did help Ukraine, but there was like turning against this country fighting for the ideals that the Americans had fought for in World War II, and it was stunning. So I would say right now things are changing so fast. I feel like I'm watching history in front of my eyes, because Europe is now pressed between Russia in the east, that war, and then the US, how is just, dealing with President Trump. The Europeans know they have to deal with him. The US cannot be an adversary. It is the ally, but is it really an ally? And it's almost, I've been in Ukraine at times when Trump has, been very friendly with Putin or said things like Ukraine is started the war, and people just, it's it's kind of sad. Yeah, they say, what is going on? And you kind of can't explain it, because it feels like the US is abandoning its ideals, and you can't really explain why. And people say, why aren't there protests? But I've seen the Ukrainians and they're just kind of devastated, but they've realized it, and it's their war, and they're doing what they have to do. That's Ukraine, but it's weird to watch that play out and watch how that affects people. The new stance of the US, how the vice president went to Hungary to campaign for Viktor Orban, who's been a thorn in the side of the EU for more than a decade, chipping away at these democratic EU
Mhm.
institutions. And Vance says, do not listen to the EU. I'm not telling you who to vote for, but Viktor Orban lost, and that was a very, very good news for the EU. But it's a very strange times wherein everything seems to be changing.
Yeah, I've often used this illustration, and I think we talked about it a little bit before, but
Mhm.
it seems the relationship between the United States and Europe is kind of like a marriage that has gone sour. And it's not a divorce. I mean, nobody has actually
Right.
walked out of the house, but you know that there's something wrong and there's something distant, and you're not sure if you can ever get it back again.
Exactly.
And so I definitely feel that way. We're concerned about the next presidency. If the next presidency kind of reverses Trump, and then there, it's sort of like going to counseling, and maybe you can
Right.
do it
Yep.
again. But if it's someone who's just like Trump, we could have a full-fledged divorce, which
Absolutely.
then which then brings up so many issues for Europe, because arming yourselves is a really expensive proposition. And we already have growing dissatisfaction in Europe between those who um, really want to rearm, and those who say no, we still need to keep the welfare state large and deep, because people are angry that they have to retire later, or they have to contribute more to their social security. So I'm just wondering if the European population can really handle this kind of deep change, which is going to
Mhm.
require them to take so much more responsibility for their own security, on top of the social commitments that governments have made to their own citizens.
Right. Well, I think it kind of depends which country you look at. The closer you are to Ukraine, the Poles, the people there on the front line, of course, the Baltics, they fully realize that Europe needs to be responsible for its own security, at least a lot more. But yeah, sometimes the farther west you are, people don't quite get it. But there is a realization that there has been this peace dividend, that the Europeans really have benefited from having the US protect them all these years. And actually, I would say that that maybe was one thing good that Trump did, is to wake Europeans up, because most Europeans I talk to say, actually, we do need to take more responsibility for ourselves and for our security, because, they see themselves as sort of between China and the US, and they have values. The Europeans have their different set of values that the US shares, but seems to be in part abandoning now. So I would say in some ways it's been a good wake up call, because Europeans, yeah, that counseling was the Biden administration, that little interlude. And
Yeah.
had Trump not been, elected again, then it probably things would have gone back to the way they were. But I think the Europeans at this point, they saw, Biden was just an interlude. Trump has been there twice. That's a real, reflection of what the U.S. is today. And I don't think that they want to fully couple themselves with America as they have been in the past. They realize that um, we have to take responsibility a bit for ourselves so that we can promote our values, live by our values, and because they know they have to end this war in Ukraine, Russia's war on Ukraine, on their terms, on Ukraine's terms, and they cannot let Vladimir Putin win, which Trump seems to be fine with giving him more territory. So it's been hard, it's been bad, but it's also been a good thing to make the Europeans, realize they need to take more responsibility for their security.
Yeah, Europe still has some real strengths.
Absolutely. I mean, you have countries like France, let's see, Britain has a shrinking army, but they have very strong defense capabilities. But the defense industry, they don't really have a big defense industry. It's the US that has that, and they're going to have to build that up. But like you said, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a decade, but they have, some joint EU, fighter projects, all kinds of different things. France has a big army. It's one of the stronger countries that has nuclear, the
Mhm,
nuclear
mhm.
weapons. So they do have things, but they need to come together. They realize they've got to come together to build some sort of defense industry where they can protect themselves.
And they also have a large economy.
They do.
So
They
yeah,
do.
we can't forget that they are still a highly developed Western, um, manufacturing and service economy. And
Absolutely. 450 million consumers. It's a huge single market, and they have clout and they can use it. And they did that in Greenland. They threatened, well, that was when President Trump was talking about we need Greenland. And the Europeans were really coming together. They were just appalled by the thought of one NATO member attacking another. And that was when they said, we are ready to use our trade weapon, called the bazooka, where they could have slapped massive tariffs on the U.S. I mean, the U.S. relies on the EU for many of its exports, so they do have their trade, their economy, and it's a big weapon. It's a big asset that they have and they can use. Yes, they have wealth, they have know-how, they have industry, and that they can do it. But it's going to take a while to get it all coordinated and
yeah,
operating.
right now they're being overwhelmed by cheap Chinese imports.
Oh yeah.
Why haven't they applied their own, fairly massive tariffs on Chinese goods, which are clearly being dumped on the European market?
Well, Germany, one of their main export markets was it, maybe the first one was China. So
Hmm.
Germany has really been shocked by the changes. And now that the US is putting tariffs and the trade is suffering there, they cannot exactly cut off China. So I think these are some of the things they're going to be talking about at the G7, these trade imbalances. So right now, Europe is looking for a way. They are reaching out to other partners. They just signed a huge deal with South America without China and without the US, the Mercosur deal. So they are looking for other partnerships now that are not the US, and they cannot. I don't know. China is a big problem, and I don't know what they're going to do. And that is why they said, the West should have stayed together. The US and EU against China really did have clout. But if they're not going to act together, I think that is something the US and the EU do agree upon, is to fight back against China's,
Hmm.
dumping and taking over of world markets. But this is new ground we're on now.
Yeah, it all kind of focuses then on Europe's ability to come together as a unified continental entity, both economically and geostrategically.
Yeah,
From the outside, it looks like that's a no-brainer. That
yeah,
40, well, our our other famous alum, Alexander Stubb, president of Finland, has called for
absolutely.
40 countries joining, either as members or joining the EU, and that would include Canada. Um,
Hmm.
and maybe some North African countries. It's just he's got a very expansive vision of what a continental power would look like. But from the outside, that seems to be the way Europe could survive in a much more realist world where power matters more than values. Sorry, Europe,
Yeah,
your talk of values is just not as um, effective when you're facing, big militaries like the Russian and the Chinese.
right.
So,
Although,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, no, just the Europeans, it's true that we look at it from America. Why doesn't Europe come together more? I mean, first of all, it is not a military or so much a geopolitical union as an economic, it's
Mhm.
first of all an economic union. But I think Europeans, if you talk to Europeans who've been to America, they come back and they say, I really feel European. But sometimes, if you're in Copenhagen or Madrid, you don't exactly feel like it's the same place, but you do realize it more if you travel somewhere like China or the US. You feel European. Um, uh,
That's a good place to pick up. Yeah. Um, European identity is, of course,
yeah.
very important. And the right wing, which
Yes.
we have to talk about,
Yes.
has undermined European identity in favor of a more nationalistic identity, which is the great struggle within European society right now. Would you say that's true?
Oh, yeah, I would say that's true. In fact, a lot of the right wing parties, disparage the EU and say we don't want to lose our identities. But actually, that's what Viktor Orban was all about. And he was resoundingly defeated. And that was a big boost for Europe. And actually, I would say that President Trump has sort of boosted European unity in another way. The right wing parties here have even said, they've even been sort of shocked by how far Trump has gone and said, no, that's not exactly what we're looking for. So, they don't even embrace Trump. The right wing in France, Marine Le Pen's party does not embrace Trump, does not embrace his embrace of Putin. So there are even core values that, that the far right seems to adhere to here that the US doesn't. So there is some sort of European through line or theme or that is really European that we see. We saw that in Hungary that they went too far. This Hungarian nationality. There is also the realization in all of these countries that they're not big enough alone to go against China and the U.S. So the only way Europe can have clout and might is by coming together. And people do realize that, even if they, in France, don't want to give up their early retirement. They do realize that France cannot go up against Russia and China, and well, not Russia, but China and the US.
Yeah. Well, um, Europe is facing its challenges. But let's end on a high note.
Okay.
You and I were both in London for, almost a week. It was really
Yeah,
great.
it was.
And I had just gotten off of our May X to the United Europe, 3 weeks traveling in Brussels and Luxembourg and Strasbourg, France. And you know, there's still great things about Europe.
Yes.
The eating and the drinking are great, and
Yes.
and just the wonderful museums and the cultural attractions, and also I guess I would say the sense of stability and I guess longevity.
Yeah.
Europe has been up and down. This is a challenging time, but it's faced more challenging times in the past and come through eventually.
People have a good way of life here. Countries have national health care, and they hear these horror stories about people getting cancer in the US and they can't afford their treatment. That doesn't happen in Europe. So people know that Europe is a good place to live, and they do want to protect it.
Well, I still want to keep going back. I had to get a visa for the UK this time, but it wasn't
Uh,
that difficult.
yeah.
Yeah, I already lament peak globalization because back in the aughts, I suppose, well, certainly before the financial crash, even a little after 9/11, it was still pretty open, and we had lots of interchange, and there was seemed to be a great spirit of togetherness within the West. But history moves on, and we've clicked past that. So, but I'm still going back to Europe. I still love the place.
I think it's still going to be here, Brent, and the Europeans are just trying to figure it out. This truly is a new world order forming, and I never thought I would see it fall apart so quickly. When you hear, it's been 75, 80 years since World War II, this new world order, and it's just, Putin started those first cracks, but along with President Trump, they're just blowing up the old world order.
There will be a new world order. I don't know what it'll look like, and I don't know if it'll settle out before I've passed
Yeah,
away from the
yeah,
planet. But yeah, we are part of a long civilization, and I have to keep reminding my students that the what looks to be a crisis in the immediate present can sometimes look very small from a historical perspective. And so we have to realize that, our responsibility is to do what is in front of us and try to work for peace and compassion and as ordered a society as possible. But we have our challenges.
we
Yeah.
do.
So, Eleanor, it's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for being our Tocqueville in Paris. And someday, I do hope to get back with a group of students to do a
I
little
hope
tour
so.
of Tocqueville's
You
estate
Yes,
and his Paris
in
locale.
Normandy.
And
Normandy, you said, right?
yeah, and we will definitely be visiting you. So,
Wonderful. I look forward to it, Brent. It was great to see you in London, and let's stay in touch.
yes, let's do. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Au revoir.
Au revoir. Thanks for listening to Tocqueville Talks. This episode was produced by Audrey Enghauser. Lucy Southwell provided administrative support. The theme music is called The Girl I Left Behind Me, a popular folk song in early 19th century America, here performed by Jacob Taylor Armerding. To learn more about our lecture series and events, our Tocqueville and Beaumont Fellows programs for undergraduates, and to listen to episodes, watch event recordings, or support our work, search on Google for the Tocqueville Center at Furman University. If you enjoyed the episode, please like, subscribe, comment, and share Tocqueville Talks on all your favorite listening services. And visit our YouTube channel for full recordings of past events and episodes. Until next time, goodbye.